Arjun Patel and his network of accomplices promised families a new life in the UK. But behind the polished offices and carefully forged documents, a £36,000 empire of fraud was thriving. One tiny mistake would unravel everything, exposing lies, greed, and a web of deception that stretched across continents. In 2019, London's bustling streets hid a secret that would soon shock the UK immigration system. At the center of it was Arjun Patel, a British-Indian entrepreneur whose life seemed perfect to anyone who looked from the outside. He owned a small but profitable consultancy firm, lived in a modern townhouse in a leafy suburb, and drove a car that matched his status. To friends and family, he was ambitious but harmless, the kind of person who could climb the social ladder without drawing attention. No one imagined that behind the neatly trimmed lawn and the tidy office, Patel was orchestrating one of the most daring immigration fraud schemes the country had ever seen. The operation started quietly, almost invisibly. Patel offered a service that seemed legitimate, helping wealthy Indian citizens navigate the UK immigration system. Many people had genuine difficulty understanding visas, work permits, and the paperwork required to move across continents. Patel claimed he could simplify the process. In reality, he was selling a shortcut, a promise that he could get clients into the UK with forged documents, fake employment contracts, and carefully manipulated bank statements. What made Patel's scheme so dangerous was the meticulous planning. Every step was calculated to avoid detection. He created fake company profiles that looked credible, complete with professional websites, official letterheads, and even fabricated tax records. He taught clients exactly what to say during interviews, coached them to answer questions convincingly, and advised them on every detail of the process. To the outside world, it looked like a reputable consultancy helping hard-working families achieve their dreams. Behind the scenes, it was a well-oiled machine funneling money from hopeful immigrants directly into Patel's accounts. The operation grew faster than anyone expected. Within 2 years, Patel had amassed $306,000, money that flowed steadily from clients convinced they were paying for legitimate assistance. The sums were significant, but never so large as to immediately raise red flags with banks or authorities. He moved funds through offshore accounts and shell companies, always careful to obscure the trail. Patel's lifestyle became more lavish, but he never flaunted it openly. He attended charity events, smiled for the cameras, and maintained an image of respectability while secretly orchestrating a web of deceit. What made Patel particularly dangerous was his ability to build trust. Clients didn't just follow instructions. They believed in him. They handed over personal information, life savings, and even family secrets, assuming they were safe. Middlemen in India recruited clients and coordinated the document forgeries. It was a network that depended on precision. A small mistake at any point could unravel the whole scheme, yet Patel's confidence was unshakable. Despite the scale of the operation, authorities remained unaware. Patel was careful, knowing that immigration fraud is difficult to detect unless there are repeated patterns or glaring errors. But the bigger the operation became, the more fragile it grew. Each falsified document, each coached interview, was a thread in a delicate web. One misstep could trigger scrutiny, and in the world of fraud, scrutiny is deadly. By the end of 2019, dozens of families had successfully passed UK immigration checks using Patel's methods. They were living their dreams, unaware of the illegal foundation beneath their new lives. Patel, meanwhile, reveled in his apparent invincibility. He had created a system that seemed untouchable, a perfect plan executed with confidence and precision. But as with any crime built on lies, perfection is an illusion. In a world where even the smallest error can have catastrophic consequences, Patel's empire was walking a fine line, one step away from collapse. Patel wasn't working alone. His operation depended on a hidden network that stretched across continents, invisible to anyone who might have tried to investigate. In India, recruiters approached families seeking a way to move to the UK. They promised opportunity, a new life, and the kind of guidance that seemed almost too good to be true. Clients were vetted carefully. Patel's team only worked with those willing to follow instructions to the letter. Even the smallest hesitation could risk exposure. Once recruited, clients were handed falsified documents, crafted to withstand scrutiny. Employment contracts were forged with professional logos and realistic pay scales. Bank statements were manipulated to show steady income. Letters of recommendation from imaginary employers carried convincing language and signatures copied from official templates. Every detail was calculated, designed to fool the most experienced immigration officers. The middlemen didn't just provide documents, they coached clients. Families were given scripts for interviews, taught how to answer questions convincingly, and warned about the smallest inconsistencies. Patel understood human behavior better than most. He knew that confident clients appeared credible, and credibility was the key to passing the UK's strict immigration checks. Families believed they were being trained for success, unaware that their success relied entirely on a web of lies. The network worked with clockwork precision. Patel coordinated payments, monitored document submissions, and ensured that no link could be traced back to him directly. He relied on offshore accounts, shell companies, and discreet transfers to keep the money flowing while leaving minimal evidence behind. His confidence grew as more applications were approved. By 2020, dozens of families were living in the UK, oblivious to the illegal foundation of their visas. Yet, the very factors that made the scheme effective also made it fragile. Patel had built an empire on exactitude, and any tiny slip could have catastrophic consequences. Every forged signature, every manipulated bank statement, every coached answer was a potential point of failure. If one document raised suspicion, investigators could dig further, and the entire operation could unravel. Patel's network was sophisticated, but it relied entirely on human error, or rather the absence of it. As the operation expanded, small anomalies began to appear. Officers at the Home Office noticed a strange pattern: clusters of approved applications with similar employment records and references. On the surface it wasn't illegal, but patterns always attract attention. Patel, however, remained confident. He trusted his system, certain that his meticulous planning and careful coaching had eliminated every risk. The truth was, no system is flawless, and no criminal network can remain invisible forever. Behind the polished offices and carefully crafted documents, the tension was rising. Each successful application fed Patel's ego, convincing him that his empire was untouchable. But the cracks were already forming. The network's success depended on secrecy, precision, and absolute control over clients and middlemen. A single misstep in India or the UK could trigger a chain reaction. In the world of fraud, the bigger the net, the more vulnerable it becomes. By the end of 2020, the operation had become an invisible web, connecting families in India to lives in London, all orchestrated by Patel. It was impressive, dangerous, and most importantly, fragile. The empire he had built on trust, lies and deception was walking a tightrope. One miscalculation, one small mistake, could collapse everything in an instant, and as Patel would soon learn, that day was closer than he could imagine. Everything changed in late 2021 with a mistake so small it seemed almost insignificant at first. One client, desperate to speed up their visa process, submitted a document that was incorrectly signed. It wasn't a glaring error, just a slight misalignment of a signature and a missing date. But in the world of immigration scrutiny, even the tiniest irregularity can trigger alarms. The Home Office flagged the document for further review, a routine procedure that would unknowingly ignite a chain reaction. When officials examined the submission more closely, they noticed details that didn't quite add up: repeated company names, identical phrasing in employment letters, and financial statements that mirrored others submitted months earlier. What seemed like a small clerical error was now the key that unlocked the door to Patel's entire network. Investigators began cross-checking the flagged application against others. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a blueprint of fraud hidden in plain sight. Each approval that had once seemed legitimate was now part of a larger, coordinated scheme. The system Patel had trusted so completely the carefully orchestrated network spanning continents was suddenly vulnerable. Every falsified document, every coached interview, and every offshore transfer became evidence waiting to be connected. Patel, confident as ever, had no idea that the operation was unraveling. He continued to manage his network with the same precision, unaware that one slip, a single incorrectly signed document, was now the spark for a full-scale investigation. Middlemen in India were still recruiting clients, teaching them scripts and preparing papers, oblivious to the growing scrutiny from UK authorities. But the system had a flaw. Patel could not control human error. Within weeks, investigators traced financial transactions, cross-referenced employment records, and identified dozens of clients whose applications were suspiciously similar. Each lead strengthened the case against Patel, painting a picture of systematic fraud that stretched across countries and involved hundreds of documents. What had once seemed invisible was now exposed under the microscope of official scrutiny. The speed of the investigation surprised everyone, including Patel. What had taken years to build was collapsing almost overnight. Authorities began freezing accounts linked to Patel and his associates, effectively halting the flow of money and cutting off the financial lifeline that had fueled the operation. The web of deceit that had seemed untouchable, when the tiniest irregularity can trigger alarms. The Home Office flagged the document for further review, a routine procedure that would unknowingly ignite a chain reaction. When officials examined the submission more closely, they noticed details that didn't quite add up: repeated company names, identical phrasing in employment letters, and financial statements that mirrored others submitted months earlier. What seemed like a small clerical error was now the key that unlocked the door to Patel's entire network. Investigators began cross-checking the flagged application against others. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a blueprint of fraud hidden in plain sight. Each approval that had once seemed legitimate was now part of a larger, coordinated scheme. The system Patel had trusted so completely, the carefully orchestrated network spanning continents, was suddenly vulnerable. Every falsified document, every coached interview, and every offshore transfer became evidence waiting to be connected. Patel, confident as ever, had no idea that the operation was unraveling. He continued to manage his network with the same precision, unaware that one slip, a single incorrectly signed document, was now the spark for a full-scale investigation. Middlemen in India were still recruiting clients, teaching them scripts and preparing papers, oblivious to the growing scrutiny from UK authorities. But the system had a flaw. Patel could not control human error. Within weeks, investigators traced financial transactions, cross-referenced employment records, and identified dozens of clients whose applications were suspiciously similar. Each lead strengthened the case against Patel, painting a picture of systematic fraud that stretched across countries and involved hundreds of documents. What had once seemed invisible was now exposed under the microscope of official scrutiny. The speed of the investigation surprised everyone, including Patel. What had taken years to build was collapsing almost overnight. Authorities began freezing accounts linked to Patel and his associates, effectively halting the flow of money and cutting off the financial lifeline that had fueled the operation. The web of deceit that had seemed untouchable was suddenly exposed for all its fragility. The most chilling realization was that Patel's downfall wasn't caused by a clever tip-off or a sophisticated sting. It was caused by the smallest human error, a single misplaced signature. His network, which had relied on exactitude, was undone not by careful investigation, but by the very unpredictability of human behavior. For years Patel had manipulated documents, coached families, and orchestrated a complex network across continents. Yet in the end it was the simplest mistake that shattered everything. By the end of 2021, the first arrests were imminent. Patel's confidence began to crumble as he realized that the operation he had thought flawless was now under the watchful eyes of investigators. The network that had seemed invincible for years was collapsing piece by piece, and the £46,000 empire that had once seemed untouchable was about to be exposed to the world. The investigation moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Once authorities connected the dots from that single incorrectly signed document, the full scale of Patel's operation became clear. It wasn't just a few forged applications. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered network of fraud spanning 2 countries. Middlemen, shell companies, fake employment records, and coached clients were all linked back to him. What had seemed untouchable for years now looked fragile, like a house of cards ready to collapse. Patel's confidence began to crack. For the first time, he realized that every forged document, every falsified signature, and every coached interview could now be used as evidence against him. Investigators traced financial transactions across multiple accounts, uncovering the flow of £36,000 from unsuspecting clients directly into Patel's pockets. Offshore accounts, once thought safe, were frozen. Companies he had created to hide his tracks were scrutinized and exposed. The authorities didn't just stop at Patel. Several accomplices, both in the UK and India, were identified. Some were recruiters who had convinced families to pay thousands of pounds for legal guidance. Others were document forgers who had created employment contracts, bank statements, and letters of recommendation. Each arrest brought new revelations, revealing just how deep and well-organized the network had been. Families who had believed they were taking legitimate steps to move to the UK were suddenly caught in the middle. Applications were revoked, visas were put on hold, and lives were thrown into uncertainty. People who had trusted Patel now faced legal battles and the harsh reality that their dreams had been built on lies. Meanwhile, Patel remained the central figure, the man who had orchestrated the entire scheme and watched as it crumbled around him. The most striking part of the collapse was how preventable it had been. Patel's empire, built on deception and precision, had survived for years because no one noticed patterns or questioned documents. Yet it took just one small error, a single missigned document, to unravel the entire network. The speed and scale of the investigation highlighted how fragile even the most sophisticated criminal operations can be. In the weeks that followed, authorities pieced together the entire story, from London offices to offices in Mumbai, from shell companies to offshore accounts. The full extent of Patel's network was exposed. Evidence showed that he had coached clients meticulously, falsified documents, and created an illusion of legitimacy so convincing that dozens of applications had passed unnoticed. But all that careful planning was meaningless once investigators had the first crack to pry open the system. By the end of the collapse, Patel's operation had been dismantled. Accounts were frozen, accomplices were in custody, and families were left in legal limbo. The £46,000 he had amassed over 2 years was now part of a larger investigation into fraud and money laundering. What had seemed like a flawless criminal empire was now just a cautionary tale, a story of ambition undone by a single, fatal human error. The collapse served as a stark warning. No matter how elaborate or meticulously planned a crime may be, it can be undone by the smallest mistake. Patel's downfall was dramatic, swift, and absolute, leaving behind a trail of legal chaos, shattered trust, and a reminder that in crime, one slip can destroy everything. The courtroom was packed the day Arjun Patel faced justice. After years of careful planning, deception, and manipulation, he now sat at the center of a scandal that had shaken both the British and Indian communities. Prosecutors laid out the full extent of his operation: £346,000 taken from clients under false pretenses, dozens of falsified documents, and a sprawling network of middlemen and accomplices. Every lie, every forged contract, and every coached interview was meticulously documented, painting a picture of a man who had built an empire on fraud. Patel's accomplices were also held accountable. Recruiters in India received sentences ranging from probation to several years in prison, while document forgers faced fines and restrictions. The court revealed how carefully Patel had orchestrated the scheme, and yet, in the end, it was a minor misstep that had exposed him. One incorrectly signed document submitted by a single client had triggered the investigation that brought down the entire network. Families caught in the scheme faced uncertainty and fear. Many had believed they were taking legitimate steps to relocate to the UK. Now their visas were under review, their status uncertain, and their dreams suddenly on hold. Some were forced to navigate complex legal battles, proving their applications were legitimate, despite the falsified paperwork orchestrated by Patel. The human cost of the fraud became painfully clear. Lives disrupted, trust broken, and futures left hanging by a thread. For Patel, the consequences were severe. Convicted of multiple charges including fraud, conspiracy and money laundering, he faced years in prison. The £46,000 he had amassed was confiscated, and his carefully constructed network was dismantled entirely. What had once seemed untouchable had collapsed completely. Every plan, every forged document, every deception was rendered meaningless. His reputation destroyed, Patel became an example of how greed and overconfidence can lead to downfall. The case sent shockwaves beyond the courtroom. It was covered extensively in the media, sparking debates about immigration policies, fraud prevention, and the vulnerabilities of legal systems. Authorities used the case to tighten regulations and improve safeguards against similar schemes, ensuring that other would-be fraudsters could not replicate Patel's methods. The scandal became a cautionary tale, showing that even the most elaborate frauds are vulnerable to small, human errors. In the end, Patel's story was not just about money or deception. It was about the consequences of overconfidence and the fragility of human schemes. For years he had manipulated systems, coached families, and orchestrated a network across continents. But one mistake, a simple missigned document, was enough to bring the entire empire crashing down. His downfall was dramatic, swift, and irreversible, leaving behind a stark lesson in crime. No matter how perfect the plan seems, one small error can destroy everything. As the courtroom emptied, the message was clear. Patel's empire was gone, his accomplices punished, and families left to rebuild their lives. The saga of £306,000, meticulously hidden lies, and a fatal mistake would be remembered as a story of ambition, greed, and the consequences that follow when deception meets scrutiny. The empire of lies was over, but the lessons it left behind would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls.